Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 19th of June. Today we're looking at really important developments, starting off with the Vavcha River front. There's also a new activation in a portion of the front line that I've talked about extensively in the region around New York and Toretsk, an area that has not been covered much, but I do think it's now very important for us to look at it, especially given the recent advances. We're also going to look, of course, at the urban battles in and around Vovchansk, which really have heated up, and we're getting now a lot of additional information which I didn't have in earlier videos, which hopefully will give you guys some more background and a better understanding of what actually unfolded there. We're starting off with this video here, which is from the area just south of Kharkivka, from June 18th, showing Ukrainian FPV drones hitting 4 Russian vehicles on the highway to Kharkov. Kharkov is only about 10 kilometers to the west at the moment from the region in which Russians are operating just south of Kharkivka. This is now becoming a very apparent vector of advance, just because you can see how the actual highway is situated in this east-west direction, heading towards such an important Ukrainian defense and logistics node. And so the Russians, they're trying to advance in this region, in the area between Kharkivka and Pobieda, for instance, in an effort to dislodge the Ukrainian forward positions that are marked in these yellow lines, mainly being defended by several elements of mechanized units and air assault units. And you can just see some of them marked over here on the map. And so for now, you have the Ukrainians withdrawing to this particular trench, and now the Russian forces trying to breach it, trying to send in some vehicles to dismount infantry and take it over. So we're going to have to keep an eye out for that advance. But based on the geolocated video we got of the 4 Russian vehicles being targeted by drones, it was an advance of about 1 kilometer westward. So you could see how the Russians are trying to basically advance through this gray zone in order to land in the next Ukrainian positions. We go further north, and there is a new video out of Yazor which verifies that the Russian forces have been able to breach the village and are now in the process of taking it over. So here we have this video. It's from June 18th as well, from the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade. Their RPVs, they hit Russian BMP, several of them, in the region around Yazor. This was done via several attack vectors. You had Russian forces likely advancing through fields and paved roads from south, from Metalove northwards, but also some coming from this southeastern direction from Romanske and attacking in conjunction. And so here we have the geolocation showing that at least one of those BMPs was able to make it to this large mansion in the southern part of the village. And that's where it was destroyed, and that's where some of the large fires have erupted. And so now we can shift the battlefield and a lot of contact to reflect that fact. And this is really a matter of time, given the fact that Yazor, it's an isolated settlement. You have perhaps several infantry squads that are holding it permanently, and then you have day in, day out rotations, retreats, withdrawal of certain forces in order to preserve manpower for the Ukrainian side. And so it's not well defended. It's isolated from other Ukrainian defensive positions in the region, which for the most part are now west of the Vavcha River, which you see on the map. And so the goal for the Ukrainians was to just hold the line here for as long as possible. They're still trying to do that, but in a way that would not really maximize their casualties. And so the consequences, many forces were withdrawn in recent weeks and months. And that means that not many are going to be cut off. Not many could be cut off potentially in a Russian assault here. But the infantry squads that are remaining, it is a question, it still is an open question as to how they get out, whether they try to withdraw from the northwest and try to reach Skuchnia and the Vavcha River over there, which could be very difficult, or whether they try to cross through the Karlivka Reservoir and the very narrow crossing there, which the Russians have targeted extensively. A lot of drones and artillery strikes towards Ukrainian targets over there. And so now we just have the confirmation of the Russians really closing in on Yazor, which, if we look at the elevation in the region, we see that the Russians already control the hills south of Yazor, which of course overlooks the valley on which it is located. And it also does give the Russians some parity in elevation to some of the heights that the Ukrainians control just west of the Vavcha River, because there really is a massive ridge, which I'm not really showing in its full entirety here in this vertical rectangle over here. and this is just one part of that ridge, which is just directly to the west of the reservoir and the river. And the Ukrainians are falling back to those lines, so those trenches, and they're doing so in a staggered way. And so the Russians, by getting control of these hills here, they are at least getting some sort of parity when comparing the forward positions of either side, respectively. And then to the north, there's even larger hills in this region that's just to the northwest of Yazarberdivka. And the fall of those fields and the Ukrainian abandonment of those positions would give the Russians additional positions to overlook, for instance, Novosibirsk, Persha, or to receive vectors of attack to harass villages that are essentially on the Vovcha River when you're looking at Skuchne, for instance, or Mezhove, which we'll get to in a second. And so let's look now at Umanske. We have this geolocated video, which is from the 17th of June. It shows 3 FPVs that hit this squad of Russian infantry located in a trench just to the north of the village. This is something that was dug by the Ukrainians most likely, and then the Russians, they occupied it with the Ukrainians unable to retain positions in an exposed area in open fields far away from the main defensive constructions. And so the Russians took it over, and the Ukrainians knew about those positions and struck them accordingly. And it gives us an idea of the furthest Russian advance in this region through these tree lines, as you can see on the map. And we could see that really the Russians are trying to inch closer from the southern vector as well into Novosibirsk, Persha. We know that there are armored assaults from the east directly, but some of these infantry-based assaults are also going on to the south. And Novosibirsk, Persha is important because, first of all, flanking it from all directions does give you the height advantage, because a lot of the flanks that Russia controls, whether it be from the south or to the northeast, are overlooking this village. And then you have 2 key crossings that start in Persha, and then they go across the Vovcha River into trenches and into the new Ukrainian fallback line that is like 5 kilometers away from the current line of contact. And you could see that I'm marking those particular crossings here in red, those 2. And so just the fall of the village would give Russians access to directly assaulting the next Ukrainian fallback line. We're looking now further north at the Sokil village, where there still is very heavy fighting at the eastern entrance. Here's a video from June 16th showing Ukraine's Shadow drone units, which is also operating across the rest of the southern Donetsk front, so it is a very busy unit. Here, their FPVs, they struck Russian infantry, they struck this Russian BRDM-2M and the infantry squad that was mounted atop of it. This is a scout vehicle. It's not really armored, doesn't really have any sort of fire supports within the vehicle that could be used to sort of fight off attackers. It's more so of a reconnaissance vehicle, very passive in nature. So it is very interesting to see it used in this sort of capacity to advance through such a battle-torn area and try to dismount troops in a region that previously there had been no Russians. And in that regard, we could look at the geolocated marker and see that there has been a Russian advance based on where the vehicle was located, 600 meters westwards. And so the Russian forces are also trying to develop this southern flank to sort of avoid attacking head-on the Sokil, because that area really has suffered a lot of casualties for the Russian side. And so they're also trying to expand southwards, perhaps to undermine Ukraine's defense in the center and western parts of Sokil. And again, I do think that the use of this vehicle, reconnaissance vehicle, is down to just simply its mobility, because they just want to quickly get troops to a certain part of the line of contact. And it does have its downsides in some cases. And it's very similar to what we see with the motorcycles being used sometimes. Now, looking directly in Sokil, you do have this process of gradual Russian advances, but we're talking about dozens of meters westwards, which is very small in scale, where you just have Russian squads, not armored or anything, advancing one by one through tree lines, through ponds, through mud, and then just a lot of the time being picked off by Ukrainian drones from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. We have some of that here, like a strike from June 17th on a Russian soldier. And so under those conditions, it's very easy to get bogged down. An area where the Russians were able to exploit their advances was just to the north, where simply putting it, the Ukrainians were unable to maintain control of this fortress, this very elaborate scheme of trenches, which would serve as a very good defensive node, but simply because the Ukrainians didn't have a solid and still don't have a solid control over the rest of Sokil, they can't really maintain connectivity to the northern trenches over here. And so it turns out a gray zone that the Russians took advantage of, while the Ukrainians withdrew to tree lines further westwards over here, where you also do have some defenses, but they're less elaborate than the ones eastwards. And so now the Russians are beginning to occupy these regions, and this is opening up a northern attack vector. And so this video is from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. They had here 4 FPV strikes on Russian soldiers in the trench as they made their way through and started clearing it out, and sort of clearing out all of the areas with trees, because this area does have a lot of foliage. A lot of the artillery shelling has not affected that particular region, at least in terms of the foliage, and so there's still a lot of it. And here we could just see the furthest extent of the Russian gains here. So if we're looking at kilometers westwards, it's something amounting to 1 kilometer westwards. Deep State, they reported on this, and so did Petrenko on June 14th, that there was initial Russian advance towards these tree lines over here, these windbreaks, you could say. And then by the 17th, 18th of June, they were able to exploit those advances and attack westwards and reach all the way to this particular point, which is not geolocated yet, but it would be the furthest Russian advance towards this new tree line. And this is important for the Russians because these areas are also on relatively high elevation as they connect to the ridge on which the rail line is located. And so not only could this strengthen the rail line vector of attack for the Russians, which has slowed down recently due to Ukrainian reinforcements being sent in, but is now gaining some new momentum due to the advances in Novo-Oleksandrivka. It could also be used to simply overlook the remaining Ukrainian positions in tributaries that are located east of the Vavcha River, like in Sokil, Voskod, Yefenivka. I'm talking about those sort of villages. And so just keep an eye out for this northern attack vector that you see over here. And going further north, we did have reports, I think it was 15th of June when we got this information, or either 17th perhaps, and it was regarding a significant Russian advance 1 kilometer to the northwest within Novo-Oleksandrivka. Here you can see the full extent of the Russian advance. It was verified on June 19th by a video from the 111th Territorial Defense Brigade, where they shelled a Russian infantry squad in the northern parts of the village. And this gives us confirmation that the Russian forces were able to continue with their momentum following the capture of the eastern portions of the village and just capitalize on that, despite the Ukrainians having several elements of brigades in the region, 111th being the most famous, but you have 100th Brigade, 100 Mechanized, 23rd Mechanized in the region. That was simply not enough to stop the Russian advance, and now they just have additional leverage along this particular paved road that leads northwards towards the highway leading to Pokrovsk, and so that is important to look forward to in the future for the Russian side. And then looking at some of the other possibilities here, we have this rectangle here. This is an area that's on higher elevation than the surrounding villages. It's a local hill that the Ukrainians currently control, but the Russians are in a prime position to take advantage of following the advances in Novo-Oleksandrivka, which have diverted Ukrainian attention towards that epicenter. And so the capture of such a hill would give the Russians a very good vantage point to overlook 3 villages in particular that are located on a valley in the region. And so that would just give the Russians a local advantage to just dominate the surrounding villages. We look further eastwards. There was, I think it was on the 17th as well, just another slight alteration by Deep State of the mapping to show that the Russians were able to get control of additional positions and trenches just the northwest of Arkhangelsk. And this is just a gradual part of the Russians trying to clear out remaining pockets of resistance, trying to clear out the gray zone and take over whatever trenches they can. For the most part, the line here is stabilized because the Russians have really prioritized other parts of the sector, Novo-Oleksandrivka, Sokil, for instance, and so less of a focus has been put on this part of the front line around Kalinove. Also, the Ukrainians did move in reinforcements. We are aware of this For instance, 115th Brigade, 112th Territorial Defense Brigade, 129th Territorial Defense Brigade. Like, the list goes on. I can list a lot of units that were, at least in part, moved here to sort of stabilize the front line. Not of the highest caliber, but they are important assets. And they also did receive a rather well-built defense line that runs through Kalinove. Kalinove itself is on a valley, and so defending it itself is difficult. And even if we look at an area further eastwards, like Alexandropol, we see that there was a slight Russian advance. This came after, I would say, 2 months of very heavy Russian bombardment of the village itself, but also of Ukrainian defensive structures nearby, including positions that are in this trench over here, this fortress along the H-20 highway, and then a lot of this fallback line, which stretches along a road that's basically is springing out from the western outskirts of New York and then connects to Kalinove, and that's where you have the Ukrainian fallback line set up. And the fallback line itself, it runs through this valley of 3 Ukrainian villages that are located on, of course, low elevation. But then the areas that are to both the east and to the west of these villages are the flanks, you would say, and they are on very high elevated ridges. And so those areas definitely are targets for the Russian forces to try to neuter. They want to try to cancel out that height advantage. And one way to do so is the capture of Alexandropol, because that region really is on high elevation as well. There's a hill on which that village is located, and so are its environs. And so if we look at the front line, we see that the Russians were able to advance from the valley on which Novobakhmutivka is located further north, get control of this polygon, which is about 1.4 square kilometers, advance 800 meters northwards, and reach the outskirts of the village. Alexandropol itself is very well defended, as I said. A lot of trenches, it's on a hill, the flanks are relatively strong, and the one, I would say, weakness is the supply lines, because you look at the entrances, for instance, from the H-20 highway or from other villages in the region, and it is a bit isolated from the main Ukrainian fallback line. And a big part of why is because the Ukrainians could not maintain their positions in other villages like Arkhangelsk that are several kilometers south of the main fallback line around New York and Kalinov, as it described. Here they were able to do so because of the elevation, but then the supply lines, they are a bit farther apart, and the Russian forces do have good positioning, maybe not the best elevation yet, but they are relatively close to the supply lines and could fire upon them. And that's going to make it hard for the Ukrainians to hold out over here for an extended period of time, especially as we see the Russian ground forces from the 132nd Guards Motor Rifle Brigade try to situate themselves in positions that are in parity with Alexandropol in order to get control over that village. And that would be just the first parts of a plan to get control of the ridges on which the fallback line basically bisects. And that would include an axis from the H-20 highway region, but also an axis from the areas and fields east of Alexandropol. Now, looking at another part of this front line that is still connected, it's still very important. Maybe it's not apparently obvious to you guys right now, but in the future it will be. It's this vector of attack that's directly east of the suburbs of Toretsk being Druzhba and Pivnishne. And so here we look at the Russian advance. It amounts to 2.7 square kilometers. This was an advance of about, I think, 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers to the west. I guess you could say 1.7 kilometers. And so the Russian forces, they advanced along 2 axes. One is these tree lines over here along the Donbas Canal, and then another one along the rail line into Druzhba. And so in terms of what they were able to accomplish, they were able to reach the first houses of those suburbs. They were also able to take control over Lift 3, this pumping station within the canal. And so this was done through an attack node from Mayorsk. That's this very small town, you could say, that is connected to the local rail station, and there's also some high-rise apartment buildings over there, and so it serves as a sort of vantage point. In terms of elevation, the Ukrainians do control highly elevated areas, for instance, these hills over here around Shumi, and so the Russian operations here are very interesting because most of the attack vectors are being conducted through a lower lying area that I'm marking in green. I guess you could say that they're advancing northwards towards these fields over here that I'm marking in the green rectangle, and those positions, those are in a gray zone right now. They are east of the Donbas Canal, and they are on a hill that overlooks some of the Ukrainian positions that are either in Druzhba or in the tree lines and fields just to the north of it. And so that would give the Russians a vantage point to assault, you could say, the northernmost flank of the city of Toretsk, which you could see in the background. And so that's just one part, but I think the main plan, or the main basically Russians opportune operation here would be to try to flank Sumy and its basically line of contact trenches from the north. What you can see is that over the course of 10 years, the Ukrainian forces built up a lot of defenses to try to defend against the Russian assault coming directly from the east, from the Horlivka area and the industrial zones, which are located on very high elevation on a lot of ridges. And then you have some Ukrainian positions also being located on hills, located in rugged terrain along a lot of these trenches here that are really well built. And they are elaborate, but some of them are not really prepared for assaults coming in from the north as opposed to attacks from the east. And so it would be a way for the Russians to try to catch the Ukrainians by surprise. And the place where they did that makes perfect sense because it's coming from Mayorsk, which is a very important forward node for the Russians, and it's also coming in an area where you don't see any sort of Ukrainian fortifications being built in a 1 kilometer gap, which now you have the Russians trying to exploit and trying to branch out from. And for instance, taking control of suburbs that are just to the east of Toretsk, that would eliminate one of the biggest issues with trying to capture the entire Ukrainian population zone in this region, because you have in Toretsk around 32,000 pre-war population and then several thousand more in the suburbs. And so it's a large population area located on a hill, trenches that are located just to the east of it. And those defenses, if you could try to flank them from the north, try to undermine their integrity, that would be a big part of eventually trying to assault it, flank it, and basically just getting closer and closer to fully taking it over. But that would be a long-term plan right now based on the extent of the Russian advance, which we're looking at, and based on the Russian units in this region, or lack thereof, because there is very small Russian troop concentration. In the same way, there's a very small Ukrainian troop concentration. I do think this was a Russian operation that was done at an opportune moment because they might have sensed the gap, perhaps due to Ukrainians not filling up all of the trenches to their full capacity. Perhaps because there was a troop rotation going on. I heard rumors of that. And when you look at the Ukrainian forces, it includes the 78th Hertz Regiment, which is a air assault unit that fought in the counteroffensive, and some territorial defense elements as well are fighting here. And so it's not really beefed up, and that could give the Russians the chance to try to just eliminate as much of the suburbs as possible before the line sort of stabilizes afterwards.